we're going to review the shootouts of law enforcement. And we're going to start with the OK Corral down in Tombstone, Arizona. And we're going to review what happened there with the EARP'S, Doc Holliday, and all the cowboys. That's fascinating. A fascinating story because most people don't realize that the EARP'S and Doc Holliday were prosecuted for shooting those cowboys that came into town to raise hell. Also, we're going to examine the North Hollywood Bank of America shootout. This was the biggest shootout that has ever occurred in the United States with law enforcement and bank robbers. We're going to examine all the facts in that, and I think you're going to find that as fascinating as the OK Corral. So let's get started. The shootout of the lawmen. Well, we're going to talk about two cases. We're going to talk about the OK Corral shootout, and then we're going to talk about the North Hollywood shootout by LAPD. So let's get started. And the OK Corral shootout, it occurred on October 26, 1881 at 3 p.m. Not at high noon, as many people think. That was another movie. So where did it occur? Well, it occurred at Tombstone, Arizona. At that time, it was a territory, not a state, and it's down by the Mexican border. So that's the location of it. And Tombstone wasn't a very large town. It kind of grew up because of mining that went on in the outlying area, but it's out in the desert of Arizona. Now, the people we're going to be talking about are the lawmen, and that's VIRGIL EARP, who was the town marshal. He was also the U.S. deputy marshal, and he had his brother that helped him out, Wyatt EARP, as well as Morgan EARP, and they had a friend, Doc Holliday, who kind of helped him out when they needed extra bodies. Now, as far as the outlaw group, or you could call them the cowboys, it was Ike Clanton and his brother Billy Clanton, and then we have the McClary brothers, Tom and Frank, and then there's a friend of theirs called Billy Claiborne. So those are the individuals we're going to be talking about for the next several minutes. Now, what was the conflict between the lawmen and the outlaws, cowboys? Well, there was a rivalry going on. The outlaws were kind of free-spirited cowboys. They had ranches, cattle ranches outside of Tombstone, and they would, go into Tombstone and I guess you'd say just raise hell. And the lawmen were the marshals, and they would try to contain all of that so it wouldn't get violent. And what happened after a while, the residents of Tombstone were tired of all the gun fighting and the shooting, blowing out windows by people riding their horses through and shooting at the storefronts. So VIRGIL EARP was hired as the marshal, and the city passed a new ordinance which stated, "It is hereby declared to be unlawful for any person to carry a deadly weapon concealed. The only exception is when they're either entering or leaving town." So that was the new law that had to be enforced, and they were hoping that that would settle things down in Tombstone. Now, there was an argument between Ike Clanton and Doc Holliday, and we don't even know what it was all about, but they were arguing over something, and Wyatt EARP stepped in and said, "Okay, enough of this," and took Doc back to the boarding house so that he could either sleep it off and the argument would subside. Later that evening, there was a card game that was held at the saloon there, and it involved VIRGIL EARP, Ike Clanton, Tom McClary, and the sheriff, Beeman. And they sat around, they had a few drinks, and they played cards. Now, Ike Clanton, for some reason, he was drinking quite a bit. He got very intoxicated, and he started shouting and saying bad things about the EARP'S, and especially Doc Holliday. So that went on, and then it broke up, and everybody went home, except Ike. He never, I guess, sobered up, because the next morning he's wandering around in town with his rifle in his hand, and he had his revolver in a holster, and he's just ranting and raving how he's going to get the EARP'S Doc Holliday. Well, by 1 o'clock, people had notified VIRGIL that Ike is wandering around with guns on his person. So VIRGIL with Morgan, they go out there, they find him, and they disarm him, take the guns from him, and then they take him over to the Justice of the Peace, where Ike is fined, I don't know, it's something like $27 for carrying the guns, and his guns are taken away from him. And then eventually he's released. And by 2 o'clock, Ike's brother comes into town, as well as Tom McClarty's brother Frank comes into town. They ride their horses in and come to the OK Corral, and they stopped and got ammunition from the local gun store there. And by this time, VIRGIL became aware that they were now in town. They had guns and they were walking around. So he and his brothers decide that they're going to tell these guys, these cowboys, they couldn't carry their guns in town. Now this is what the shootout scene looks like. Now we hear it's the OK Corral. Well, the OK Corral is way in the back area. All of it occurs really on Fremont Street between 3rd and 4th, and it's kind of the alleyway that goes back to the OK Corral. So what happens at the very beginning, so you know where everybody is located, there's Fremont Street. VIRGIL and Wyatt, as well as Morgan, the EARP brothers, are kind of in the street area. They've got their guns with them. They've got these black coats on, and Doc Holliday has accompanied them. Now, as far as the cowboys or the outlaws, we have Ike Clanton, who is there with Billy Claiborne, Frank, and Tom McClarty, and then Billy Clanton is on the far side. So that's where they're all standing, and then VIRGIL tells Ike, you guys, you can't have guns in town. You've got to leave them at the saloon. So there's a discussion that goes on between VIRGIL and Ike, and eventually, when it gets tense, Ike takes off running and he goes into the boarding house. Now, we know that Billy Clanton and Tom McClarty, they have their guns, they have their hands on their gun, and they are they in the process of taking him out of the holster? But they cock them. They cock their guns, and Billy apparently shoots at the direction of Wyatt. Now Wyatt, he had inside information that he knew that Frank McClarty was a sharpshooter who was very, very good with the gun. So Wyatt immediately pulls his gun and shoots Frank. So that's what happens at the very, very start of it. And then the gunfire takes hold. Now Billy McClarty, he takes off running. And what happens next is that within seconds, Doc Holliday, he has in his hand a shotgun that VIRGIL had handed him, and he fires at Tom McClarty, striking him, and then he takes his revolver and then shoots Frank McClarty. Almost instantaneously, Morgan then fires at Billy Clanton as well as Frank McClarty. But at the same time, the cowboys are shooting at the EARP'S and Doc. Now, what are the casualties of it all? Well, we know that Frank McClarty and Tom McClarty are shot and die right there, as well as Billy Clanton. So they're dead, but the lawmen took a few hits themselves. Virgil is shot in the calf. Morgan is shot, a bullet kind of goes through his shoulder blades. And Doc, I don't know whether it's superficial, but he's shot in the hip. Not seriously injured, but he was hit. But Wyatt Earp is the only one that came out unscathed, not hit at all. So the dead men, they have a funeral in town. The undertaker sets them up, and all three of them are laid in these coffins. And eventually the carriage comes and takes their caskets up to Boot Hill. That's an area that overlooks the city of Tombstone. So that is what happened. But what was interesting, right afterwards, the sheriff comes up to Wyatt and attempts to arrest him for this shootout. And he says, "I need to arrest you." And Wyatt makes a statement. He says, "Not today, since I'm injured." Well, now he hadn't been injured, but he makes a statement, and that was it. The sheriff didn't do anything else. And it wasn't until October 31st that the sheriff charged them with murder and had them arrested. And both Wyatt and Doc Holliday are put in jail, and this is the jail that they were in, and were held there until a preliminary hearing was set. Now, it was maybe a month later that Judge Wells Spicer held this preliminary hearing to listen to all the evidence as to what went on at the OK Corral Shootout. So he conducts the hearing with witnesses. A number of witnesses came in and testified for the cowboys, and they said some of them were unarmed who were shot at. And it wasn't until the defense was put on, and Wyatt Earp got up there and he read a dissertation of something he had written out that explained step by step by step what had happened as far as his recollection, who shot first and why, and what weapons were involved. And Judge Spicer listened to it, and afterwards he found there was insufficient evidence to hold them to answer for the murder charge, and they were released. So Wyatt and Doc were released and were not in custody any longer. However, there was a great deal of resentment in the community, not just from the cowboys, but from others that kind of felt that maybe this was an overreaction by the lawmen. So it didn't happen just from the cowboys, but Sheriff Beeman had been employed by the cowboys, the Clantons, earlier. So he kind of took the cowboy side, as well as the newspaper. It was kind of anti-Earp. So there was a lot of resentment, and the Earps lost their job as marshal and police officers in Tombstone. However, what happened next was pretty devastating to the Earps, and that is that Virgil is walking down Allen Street by 5th Street, and somebody shoots at him and hits him, hits his hand, and Morgan is also shot maybe 3 months later, not too far away. So to kind of recap, Virgil is shot in the hand, and it was a bad shot, a bad injury. He lost the use of that hand. He had a number of operations trying to reconstruct so that he could use that hand, but he couldn't, and that meant he could not effectively work as a lawman because he couldn't hold a gun in that hand. Now, as far as other things that are happening to the Earps, as I said, Morgan is playing billiards in one of the pool halls, and somebody came up from behind him and shot him and killed him right there in the pool hall. And Wyatt is right behind him, and Wyatt is not struck. Now, a bullet was fired at him, but missed the target. So Wyatt survived, Morgan did not. And it was decided at that time that, the family is going to leave Tombstone, it's too dangerous. And they transport Morgan's body to Colton, California. And that is where the parents of the EARP'S, they live. So they're all leaving, and they are moving out of town. They leave Tombstone. Now, as far as what happened to Virgil out of all of this, well, he eventually married Allie, or Elvira, and they moved to this house in Colton, California. And it's kind of interesting. They kind of went from place to place, but most of the time they would come back to Colton, even though they had a number of saloons they had in various mining towns. And they did some mining. And Virgil even did some refereeing of boxing matches. So they did various things, but not what you would think that a famous lawman did. And it was, he lived there in Colton for many years. He was 60, died of pneumonia, and his wife, Allie, had him buried at her family plot up in Portland, Oregon. So that is what happened there as to Virgil. But now as to Wyatt, what was interesting, as to his background, he had been married at one time, and his first wife died of childbirth, and then he met this Maddie Blaylock, and she worked at a brothel, and they, got to know each other in Dodge City, and the relationship developed. And she moved with him when he left Dodge City and went to Tombstone. Now, she had a back pain, and she took this laudanum for the pain, and she got addicted to it, and it really affected her. She did go with the EARP family out to Colton, California. She stayed out there for a short period of time, but when Wyatt didn't rejoin her, she went to Penal City. It was an old mining town. Wyatt kind of went on with his life. He had met Josephine SADIE Marcus. Now, she worked as a prostitute at one of the brothels, and eventually settled down with the sheriff, Sheriff Beeben. Now, he's the sheriff that arrested Wyatt and had him prosecuted for murder. Now, Wyatt and Josephine started an affair among themselves, even though she was kind of married to the sheriff. And, that didn't go over too well with the sheriff. But that's how they got together. And eventually, when Wyatt went up to San Francisco area, she went up there and joined him. And from there on, they lived together for 50 years. Josephine and Wyatt lived for many, many years, and she was, without a doubt, a tough broad. She was a character, and they did a lot of different things and were involved in a lot of different things. And there was a lot of pressure to make Wyatt one of the legends of the Wild West. And many people thought he was one of the people who brought law and order to all those mining towns. And he did, in a way, at Tombstone as well as at Dodge City. He was tall. He was tall, over 6 feet, strong individual, and he had a no-nonsense, steely eyes. Everybody always mentioned about his eyes. They remembered him. Now, he had had contact with Wild Bill Hickok, and Hickok had taught him how to shoot, especially buffalo. And he may have had contact with Buffalo Bill. Now, these were all legends of the Wild West, And Wyatt Earp, you know, he fell into that category, and his image was enhanced by books that were written by various people. This John Flood, he worked with Wyatt and Josie in the memoirs, Legend of Wyatt Earp and the Gunfight at the OK Corral. And then Stuart Lake wrote a book later on, Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal. And also Josie wrote a book, I Married Wyatt Earp. But she didn't tell all. She refused to tell about her working as a prostitute in a brothel, and that's how she kind of met Wyatt. And she doesn't talk about her affair she had with Sheriff Beeman, the one who arrested and tried to have Wyatt prosecuted for murder. However, there were movies, and Wyatt, when he lived in Los Angeles, very close to Hollywood, the movie makers would ask him to help them make the silent movies, the westerns. And he did. He did that for a number of years. And eventually movies were made about Wyatt. And one of them was by John Ford called My Darling Clementine. So it was books and movies that made the legend. But what always fascinated me was, you know, he was more at home being a prospector, and a city named Earp out by the Colorado River, it's a city named Vidal. They had a place out there, and this was their home where Ollie and Wyatt, they spent many, many, many years out there mining, prospecting, and one of their mines was the Happy Day mine, and then one was the copper accident mine. They were looking for gold, and accidentally they found copper, and it was very prosperous. And one of their later mines was called Lucky Day Mine. So isn't that interesting? Here, you know, the legend of Wyatt Earp was mainly a prospector out at Vidal Junction in San Bernardino County. You know, this was one of the last photos of him, and this was their home where they lived in Los Angeles on 17th Street. And they lived a kind of an ordinary life, but he wasn't a gunslinger. He was many things. He was a saloon keeper. He was a professional gambler for a while. So many, many different occupations that he had over the years. And at time of death, he lived till he was 80 in 1929, where he died in Los Angeles. And the pallbearers at his funeral were William S. Hart and Tom Mix. They were famous actors at the time. And this was his tombstone. His wife, Josie, had his body taken up to Colima outside of Oakland, California, and that is where he and Josie are buried. Now, what happened to Doc Holliday? It was kind of interesting that he was a dentist. Then he didn't like that job and he became a gambler. And his common law wife, her name was Big Nose Kate. And it was never clear as to exactly why she was called Big Nose Kate. She did have a prominent nose, but they always said that she always stuck her nose into other people's business. But she outlived everybody, and she wrote a book, according to Kate, and gave all the inside story, what went on with Doc Holliday and the EARP'S. Now, for some reason, we don't know the reason, Doc Holliday parted his ways with the EARP'S, and he moved to Colorado, and he had a problem with his health, tuberculosis, and became very ill. And they thought that the weather in Colorado would be better for him. And that's where he lived, and he died there in 1887 at the age of 36. And it was kind of interesting. You know, in the obituary, it talks about Big Nose Kate was with him at the very, very end. And this is where he was buried in Colorado. All right. The OK Corral, as I say, was famous, and maybe one of the reasons was because of the movie. The gunfight at the OK Corral was Kirk Douglas and Burt Lancaster. Made it very, very famous. Now you take, how much of that, the OK Corral was fact and how much it was fiction. Well, it's a little of both. The OK Corral was based on fact, but there was a little bit of fiction that was mixed into it, partly due to Josie and Allie, both of the wives of Virgil and Wyatt, kind of wanted to tell the story their way. Now, if you want to go to watch the shootout at the OK Corral, you can go out to Tombstone, Arizona, and at 3 o'clock they will reenact another shootout at the OK Corral. Now, let's move on to our next case, and that is the North Hollywood Shootout. And there's a movie made of that, and it was called The 44 Minutes. And that's the amount of time it took, and it's considered the longest and bloodiest shootout in law enforcement history. And it occurred on February 28, 1997 at 9:30 in the morning. These robbers decided to rob the Bank of America in North Hollywood, and they were well armed. And here you can see Laurel Canyon Boulevard at Archwood Street, and there's where the bank is located. And how it all occurred, the robbers went in on the north entrance. There was two entrances to the bank, but this is on the north side, so they wouldn't be seen as much. Now, they parked right over there, and you can see that parking lot, and there's Laurel Canyon Boulevard. Now, what happens, they knew that they were going to be able to do that robbery, and they had planned it out, and the two individuals were Larry Phillips and Emil Matasareanu. He was Romanian, who had come to the United States, and they had met down in Venice at Gold's Gym. They were both interested in weightlifting and very muscular, both of them. And they developed a friendship, and they decided to do robberies together. And they went to Colorado, and that's where they did a number of armored car robberies. And then they did a Brinks robbery in 1995, in which one of the guards was killed and another one was injured. Another, in 96, did two Bank of America robberies, made over $1.5 million. Well, that was their style, and they really prepared well. They knew that there was a way that they could do these robberies and they could get away with it. So what happened in this case was they knew there was going to be a large shipment to the B of A in North Hollywood. And they knew they had 8 minutes before the LAPD North Hollywood Division units would respond. So they could do, if they could do the robbery in 8 minutes, they would get away with it. However, what went wrong this particular day, there was a police car, LAPD police car, just happened to drive by Laurel Canyon Boulevard. They're driving by, and the officers look over at the bank, and they see the two robbers in armored vests with their guns out going into the bank. So they go in, and here you can see them. That is a picture of them entering the B of A. They go in and they demand all the money and the safe. They knew there was going to be a big shipment that was supposed to be in there. Now, the dispatcher gets the information from the officers who were driving by, and tells all of the LAPD officers in the area to go to the Bank of America. And they have completely surrounded the bank on all sides. Now, when one of the robbers comes out, he looks and he sees all these police cars. And he sprays them. He starts shooting at the police cars. He's mad about the fact that they had been spotted. And here you can see some of the people that were shot at in the parking lot. So as they're spraying all the police cars, the one goes back inside so they can regroup to figure out how are they going to get out. Now, just to show the difference in weapons that the bank robbers had, they had all of these automatic assault rifles, AK-47s. They have AR-15s, the Bushmaster. One had a 100-round magazine that they had. So they were well armed and supplied with ammunition. Now, as far as the police, well, they didn't have much of anything. They had 9mm Berettas, as well as 38 caliber revolvers, and a few 12 gauge shotguns. So that's all they had, and there was no question that the police were outgunned in every way. So what the police do when they realize that they're being sprayed with automatic weapons, a group of the officers take off in one of the police cars and goes to a local gun store, goes in there and asks and begs the gun owner to give them some AK-17s, and the gun store does it. So they come out, and now they have some automatic weapons that they can fire back. At the same time, the SWAT team for LAPD was downtown Los Angeles. They were doing an exercise down there, and when they heard about the shootout, they leave downtown, and they're going code 3 as fast as they can to get out to the Bank of America branch in North Hollywood. So some of the officers are injured. They're shot at, and they go down, and the shooters, the robbers, are going out, and they get into this Chevrolet. One is driving, Emily is driving it, and Phillips is walking at the side of it with the trunk open, and he keeps reaching in for more guns and ammunition. That is, now here you can see them driving out. They're coming out in that white Chevrolet, and here you can see the police car there that they're shooting at, and the officers trying to duck for cover. Now, Phillips is walking on the sidewalk, and he's going down, and he has some cover by a 18-wheeler, and he's kind of protected, but the police are able to continue to shoot out, but everything just bounces off of him. He has got body armor, but eventually he is struck and goes down. Now, as to the car keeps driving down, but it is struck, and the tires are blowing out. So this is the one, Matasareanu is driving this, and he knows he needs to get another car, and he sees the Jeep pull up and stop, and the owner of the Jeep jumps out and leaves that car and runs. And you can see him there. He's running backwards. So Emil, the robber, pulls up next to the Jeep, and here you can see, this is a better one. You can see he pulls up right adjacent to the Jeep truck. He takes everything out of the car, the money as well as the other weapons, and throws them in the truck, the Jeep truck. But at the same time, the SWAT team arrives. They didn't realize that the car, the robbers, had gone down, or he had driven down the street for 3 blocks, and they didn't realize they were in the line of fire. So as soon as they got there, the 3 officers from SWAT, they jump out on the other side, try to get some protection, and they're being shot at. So the SWAT team, they take the weapons that they have and try to get a position where they could shoot back. And they realize with the body armor that the robber had on, there was no way they were going to be able to take him down, because everything just bounced off of him, except for his feet. They realized that he didn't have any body armor on his feet. And so they get down low and they fire their weapons back at his feet, and they hit him. They hit his feet and he goes down. So he is now down in the front of the car. They were driving the Chevrolet, and they go up to him and they see that he's been shot and he's bleeding, and then they handcuff him. And so there, now there's a good shot. You can see the circle that he is lying there, and they have guns pointed toward him, and he's still moving around, and he's not being cooperative at all, and he's telling him to go pound sand, and he's just asking him, yeah, shoot me in the head, shoot me in the head. So that was the situation. Now there was an ambulance that was supposed to go over to him, but then there was a dispute as to whether the ambulance was told to go away, because there was a question as to whether there were others in the area, other robbers. Now here you can see the Jeep truck that was shot. You can see the gun that he was firing right there, and it was still loaded, and that was when he fell. So they don't know whether there's other people who could be shooting at him. So they, at the bank, they check all the people in the bank, because they had been locked in a vault, to see how many there were. Well, as to the casualties, 12 officers were injured. One was seriously injured from the gunfire from the 2 robbers. There were 8 civilians that were injured, as well as the dog that was hit. Now, what was interesting about all the injuries, both of the robbers were shot and died at the scene. One, Phillips, had shot himself. Now, as far as Emil, he died right there, and the question was, did he bleed out? His children filed a lawsuit against the police officers there, claiming they violated his civil rights by permitting him to bleed out. And the case went to trial. As a matter of fact, it went to a federal court, and it resulted in a hung jury. However, a number of the jurors found for Emil's children that his civil rights had been violated by not getting an ambulance there fast enough in order to take him to the hospital where he might have been saved. So that was kind of an interesting thing. You kind of wonder if the justice system is a little out of balance, where here the robber, who has all the weapons and is firing at the officers and hitting the officers and injuring the officers, it's the officers who are sued by his relatives for not getting assistance there fast enough to prevent him from bleeding out. So anyway, as to the 2 infamous shootouts, we have the shootout at the OK Corral and the North Hollywood shootout. At the one, the police were prosecuted. You know that Wyatt was prosecuted there. Eventually he got off. And in the other one, the police officers were sued by one of the robbers' family members. Eventually the case was dropped after the hung jury. But kind of interesting what happened to law enforcement in both of those cases. You found this episode fascinating about the shootout of the lawmen. If you want more information about what detectives go through and law enforcement, I've done 2 books about investigation of murder cases. One is called Detectives Tracking Down Killers, and a similar book, Tenacity Solve Murder. So if you want more about detective work and investigation, get my books on that. Well, hopefully you will join us again for another True Crime Files of Los Angeles, when we examine another case. See you then.